The Ammons House. In November 2011, a modest rental home on Carolina Street in Gary, Indiana, became the focal point of one of the most documented supernatural investigations in American history. What began as a routine welfare call quickly spiraled into a state-sanctioned inquiry involving law enforcement, medical personnel, and the Department of Child Services. Inside that small, beige house, witnesses claimed to see children levitate, walk backward up walls, and speak in growling voices. What made it impossible to dismiss was not who made the claims, but who confirmed them. Doctors, police officers, government workers, all left shaken. What happened in that house was never meant to be explained away. The case centered around Latoya Ammons, a single mother of 3. The family reported that after moving in, they began to experience swarms of black flies in the winter, heavy footsteps stomping through the night, and mysterious wet footprints appearing on the floors. Her children began showing disturbing behavioral changes, growling, speaking in deep voices far beyond their age, and blanking out with no memory of violent outbursts. By April 2012, the situation escalated so severely that emergency services and state agencies were called in. DCS worker Valerie Washington arrived with a local police officer to evaluate the children's condition. While at the hospital, they claimed to witness something beyond rational comprehension. One of the boys walked backward up the wall in a smooth motion, flipped over his grandmother, and landed upright, never letting go of her hand. Both the caseworker and the officer submitted formal reports under oath, stating what they saw was physically impossible. No drugs were involved, no trickery suspected, just something they could not explain. Photographs taken by investigators later showed strange mists and silhouettes in rooms thought to be empty. A recording device malfunctioned each time officers tried to interview the family in the house. Another officer reported being physically pushed by an invisible force. One photograph taken outside the house revealed a shadowy figure peering from the front porch when no one was inside. These were not accounts from ghost hunters or local legends. They came from government agents, and they were logged into official police records. The case garnered so much attention that the local police chief assigned multiple officers to monitor the house. Reverends and clergy were called in to bless the rooms. One attempted exorcism was performed by Father Michael Maginot with the diocese's approval after interviews with DCS and the police. He reported that Latoya and her children were being targeted by what he called multiple demonic presences, and proceeded with 3 intense rites of exorcism, one of which was sanctioned by the Catholic Church, a rare move in modern times. Despite the gravity of the case, no official scientific or psychological explanation was ever determined. The Department of Child Services eventually removed the children from the home temporarily, not for abuse, but due to what was termed environmental spiritual harm. Eventually, the family moved out. The new owners of the property never reported similar incidents. In a rare move, the state of Indiana allowed access to hundreds of pages of DCS documentation. These included direct transcripts, psychological evaluations, and photographic evidence. The case files revealed how high-ranking officials struggled to navigate an event that didn't fit into any existing legal, medical, or psychological category. Yet, the deeper authorities went into investigating the home, the more the case unraveled accepted boundaries of logic. Paranormal investigator Zach Boggins later purchased the home and filmed a documentary called Demon House, during which several of his team members reportedly fell ill or experienced severe psychological reactions. Boggins eventually demolished the home, citing that it was too dangerous to exist. If this had been an isolated case, it might be easy to dismiss, but what makes the Ammons House different is that the supernatural claims were not made by believers or thrill seekers. They were documented, sworn, and signed by police officers, medical workers, state agents, and clergy. People whose jobs depend on accuracy and logic, people who walked into a modest house in Indiana and walked out forever, changed. So, the question remains. If seasoned officials witnessed a child walk up a wall and still couldn't explain it, what exactly were they dealing with? The Enfield Poltergeist. In August 1977, in a quiet working-class suburb of Enfield, North London, an ordinary brick house at 284 Green Street became the center of what would become the most thoroughly documented and hotly debated poltergeist case in British history. The Hodgson family, single mother Peggy and her 4 children, had lived there for years without incident. But suddenly, furniture began shifting on its own. Knocking sounds echoed through the walls, and 11-year-old Janet Hodgson began to speak in voices not her own. Then, one night, a police officer witnessed a chair glide across the floor unaided and filed an official report. What started as a domestic disturbance call became a national phenomenon, one that even Scotland Yard could not completely write off. The events began after the children complained that their beds were shaking. The mother dismissed it until a heavy chest of drawers moved 4 feet across the room on its own, and resisted all attempts to push it back. By the following week, objects began flying across rooms. Doors slammed shut violently, and cold spots formed without explanation. Concerned for her family's safety, Peggy Hodgson called the local police. Officers Carol Heaps and Graham Morris arrived expecting a simple domestic call. What they encountered instead was a home alive with activity. Officer Heaps filed a signed statement in which she described witnessing a large armchair levitate and slide across the floor several feet without visible force. Her partner confirmed the account. They examined the structure for hidden wires or mechanisms and found nothing. Unable to intervene in something outside their legal scope, they reported the event but took no further action. But the official record remains, a sworn statement by a British police officer attesting to physical movement of objects by unseen forces. The case drew the attention of the press, particularly the Daily Mirror, which began chronicling the events. Reporters, photographers, and eventually researchers from the Society for Psychical Research visited the home. Photographic evidence soon followed. Images of Janet levitating from her bed, not in a limp fall, but with arms extended, as if flung by an invisible force. Audio recordings captured guttural, masculine voices coming from Janet. Voices that identified themselves as various dead individuals, including a man named Bill Wilkins, later verified to have died in the house years prior. Perhaps most disturbing were the changes in Janet herself. She would enter trance-like states, her voice deep and harsh. Medical and psychological evaluations failed to determine any signs of schizophrenia, dissociative identity disorder, or manipulation. During a hospital observation ordered by authorities, events continued. Toys flew across the room, electrical equipment malfunctioned, and Janet entered a catatonic state during which her heart rate spiked dangerously high. The Ministry of Health was informed, and the case escalated to national concern. Clergy members performed blessings. Investigators tried to debunk the events by isolating Janet in monitored rooms, but disturbances persisted even when she was absent. Skeptics accused the family of faking for publicity, but the sheer number of independent observers, dozens of journalists, police, and medical professionals, made outright dismissal difficult. The home was monitored continuously for over a year. Eventually, the activity declined and the family moved on. But the legacy of the Enfield case remained. It was the first and only time a British police officer filed an official report confirming apparent paranormal activity. The Society for Psychical Research catalogued over 2,000 separate incidents, including levitations, unexplained voices, and flying objects. The British media documented much of it in real time. Unlike most hauntings, this one came with witnesses bound by law and reputation. The Enfield case has since been dramatized and fictionalized in films and documentaries, most notably in The Conjuring 2. But underneath the Hollywood veneer lies a sobering fact. Official police records still list 284 Green Street as the site of an unexplained physical disturbance. The file was never closed. No arrests, no fraud charges. Just an open-ended account of something that defied natural law. So the question stands. When law enforcement documents the impossible, does the burden of proof shift from the witness to the world? The Smurl Haunting. In 1974, Jack and Janet Smurl moved into a quiet duplex at 328 Chase Street in West Pittston, Pennsylvania, seeking a fresh start after a devastating flood had destroyed their previous home. But within weeks, their lives descended into a terrifying ordeal that would stretch over 13 years, drawing in police, clergy, psychologists, and eventually some of the most prominent paranormal investigators in America. This was not just another ghost story whispered by neighbors. This was a case so violent and persistent that it made its way into court records, media broadcasts, and Catholic exorcism logs. The Smurls began noticing subtle disturbances, kitchen appliances malfunctioning without cause, dark stains appearing and disappearing on the walls, foul odors with no discernible source. Their daughters reported hearing whispering voices at night. Jack was woken multiple times by something tugging at his bedsheets. As months passed, the activity escalated. Banging sounds from inside the walls, scratches appearing on their bodies, and eventually full-body apparitions manifesting in broad daylight. What made the events chilling was their consistency. No matter how many times they cleaned, fixed, or prayed, the phenomena returned stronger. In one of the most disturbing reports, Janet claimed to have been physically assaulted by an invisible presence. Jack later recounted an experience where he was pinned down by what he described as a black mass with a hole where its face should be. The family turned to the police several times, particularly after neighbors began complaining of strange noises and disturbances. Officers visited the home on multiple occasions, yet could find no natural cause for the noise, broken fixtures, or unexplained drafts. No charges were filed, but reports were made. Their desperation led them to the Warrens, Ed and Lorraine, the famed demonologists also involved in the Amityville and Enfield cases. After visiting the home, the Warrens declared that the Smurls were dealing with 4 distinct entities, one of which they described as inhuman and violent. They claimed that the demonic presence had attached itself not just to the home, but to the family itself, making it impossible to escape by moving. The local diocese authorized an exorcism, not once, but 3 times. During the rituals, family members were reported to have entered trances, with one child allegedly levitating above her bed. Strange marks appeared on the walls. But the hauntings did not stop. In fact, each attempt to intervene seemed to escalate the activity. Skeptics, including several psychologists, suggested mass hysteria or stress-induced delusions. Yet none of the family members were diagnosed with mental illness, and the activity was witnessed by people outside the family, including neighbors and a visiting nurse who fled the house after experiencing what she called a cold hand grab her wrist. Despite ongoing debate, the Smurls passed polygraph tests and stuck to their stories until the end. Local law enforcement became increasingly uncomfortable with the case. Officers refused to stay in the house for extended periods. Eventually, reports indicate that the family was advised by town officials to seek spiritual help, an indirect admission that authorities were out of answers. The Smurls were not the only ones suffering. Tenants on the other side of the duplex began experiencing similar events and moved out within months. In 1986, the story broke into the mainstream press. Newspapers across the U.S. published accounts of the haunting. TV crews arrived. Public opinion split. But one thing was certain. Something was happening at 328 Chase Street that no one, not police, not clergy, not scientists, could bring to a halt. Eventually, the Smurls relocated. Activity reportedly diminished, but minor disturbances continued for years. The house was sold and later renovated. New residents have offered mixed reports, some denying any issues, others refusing to comment. But buried in the records of local police, the diocese, and news archives remains a trail of signatures, statements, and incident logs pointing to something very real, something no one was able to stop. If a haunting forces police to look away, clergy to admit defeat, and families to flee their own homes, then the question isn't whether the horror was real. It's what kind of reality allows it to persist. The Vallecas Apartment. In the fall of 1991, a small apartment on Luis Marin Street in the working-class Vallecas district of Madrid became the epicenter of Spain's most infamous supernatural investigation. The case would ultimately involve multiple police officers, medical staff, social workers, and even state prosecutors, all drawn into a haunting so disturbing that the property was eventually sealed off. What began as a grieving family's private mourning spiraled into a national scandal after an official police report confirmed a violent presence inside the apartment. This wasn't folklore. It was a documented confrontation with something no law could prosecute. The haunting began after the death of Estefania Gutierrez Lazaro, an 18-year-old girl who had allegedly dabbled in occult rituals using a homemade Ouija board with classmates. According to her family, Estefania began experiencing seizures, hallucinations, and whispered voices in the weeks following the seance. Despite repeated medical examinations, no neurological disorder could be found. Then, In August 1991, she died suddenly and inexplicably. The death certificate listed cardiac arrest, but the autopsy noted no detectable cause. Soon after Estefania's funeral, the family reported bizarre activity in the apartment. Doors slammed shut without warning. Whispering voices echoed from empty rooms. Photographs of Estefania warped, their faces burned or scratched. One particularly chilling moment came when the family's crucifix was found twisted, its figure inverted against the wall. But things grew darker when the remaining children were awoken by shadowy figures standing at the foot of their beds, whispering their sister's name. Terrified, the Gutierrez family contacted the police. Officer Jose Pedro Negri and 3 colleagues arrived at the scene. Expecting a domestic disturbance or prank, they entered cautiously. What followed shook them to the core. In their official report, officers documented sudden cold spots, untraceable noises, and a loud bang that originated from inside a sealed cabinet. A heavy wardrobe swung open with such force that one officer staggered backward. A crucifix reportedly detached from the wall and landed several feet away while they were watching. The most damning detail: officers found deep scratches on a locked wooden door with no evidence of tampering. The family insisted no one had touched it. The officers examined the door for tricks or external tools. Nothing. They were unable to explain the scratches. Nor could they explain the sudden onset of dizziness, nausea, and disorientation felt by 2 members of the unit while in Estefania's former bedroom. The official report, dated November 1992, includes the phrase, "We cannot find a natural explanation for these events." The case reached the attention of state media and investigative journalists. Skeptics accused the family of exploiting their daughter's death. But the police report remained untouched, a rare acknowledgement by law enforcement of an unexplained, possibly supernatural event. Even Spanish legal experts admitted that the report set a precedent, the first time police had publicly confirmed experiencing paranormal phenomena during an active investigation. Eventually, the family moved out. The apartment changed tenants several times and was eventually abandoned. Some say the property was informally blacklisted by local housing authorities. The case became known as El Expediente Vallecas, the Vallecas File, and remains one of the only state-documented hauntings in Europe. Unlike many poltergeist stories that rely on hearsay, this one comes embedded in government paper, stamped and filed. A single line from the report continues to resurface in Spanish paranormal circles. The witnesses are deemed credible, and events are considered real, though unexplained. If the law itself, built on reason and evidence, acknowledges a haunting, what does that say about the boundaries of law and reality? The Perron House. In January 1971, Roger and Carolyn Perron moved into a sprawling 18th-century farmhouse in Harrisville, Rhode Island, along with their 5 daughters. The home, located on a 200-acre plot and known historically as the Arnold Estate, had stood for centuries and bore a past as dark as its creaking wooden halls. What the Perrons encountered over the next decade would become one of the most infamous hauntings in American history, eventually inspiring the Hollywood film The Conjuring. But beneath the dramatization lies a disturbing reality. Multiple visits by law enforcement, repeated reports filed with local clergy, and the eventual intervention of demonologists Ed and Lorraine Warren, all attempting to stop something that refused to be explained or exorcised. It began with minor occurrences, sweeping cold drafts, the sound of distant voices, and the unmistakable stench of rotting flesh that would come and go at random. Doors would swing shut on their own, brooms moved across rooms without human contact, and the children complained of whispers in the night. Carolyn found piles of dirt in rooms she had just cleaned. Lights flickered despite updated wiring. The family tried to rationalize everything, but soon the phenomenon turned physical. The Perrons reported being pushed, scratched, and held down by invisible forces. One daughter awoke to find her bed levitating. Another saw a woman dressed in gray standing over her, mouthing words she couldn't hear. Carolyn suffered the most. She described losing hours of memory, waking up in unfamiliar parts of the house, and being overcome by an external force that seemed to target her specifically. As the disturbances intensified, Carolyn began researching the house's history. What she found was deeply unsettling. The property had been in the same family for generations, and was linked to multiple suicides, drownings, and murders. One name surfaced repeatedly: Bathsheba Sherman, a woman rumored to have been involved in the occult, accused of killing her infant son in the 1800s. Though never convicted, legend held that she cursed the land before her death. The timeline of Bathsheba's life eerily aligned with the violent energy the family described. Unable to cope, the Perrons reached out to local priests. They performed blessings, but nothing changed. The family then contacted Ed and Lorraine Warren, who visited the house multiple times. Lorraine reported feeling a malevolent, ancient presence and identified Bathsheba as the entity haunting the home. During one session, Carolyn reportedly levitated and was thrown across the room. The Warrens recommended a formal exorcism, but the local clergy declined to authorize it. Meanwhile, police were summoned more than once due to reported disturbances. Officers recorded family members in states of extreme fear, injuries without clear cause, and objects in disarray with no signs of forced entry. They never filed criminal charges, but made it clear in their reports that something beyond domestic disturbance was occurring. When asked, one officer reportedly stated, "There's nothing to arrest here, but I won't step foot in that house again." The Perrons endured the haunting for nearly 10 years. They couldn't afford to move, and few believed their accounts. Eventually, in the early 1980s, they left the property. The new owners who followed denied any supernatural activity, though some reportedly broke their leases early, without explanation. Despite decades passing, the original police records and the Warrens' detailed case files remain. Lorraine Warren stood by the legitimacy of the case until her death. Multiple members of the Perron family have independently described the same events, never seeking financial gain, only understanding. If multiple children, parents, police officers, and professional investigators all describe the same unexplainable force, and none of them recant, then at what point does disbelief become a form of denial? The Bridgeport Poltergeist. In November 1974, the quiet residential neighborhood of Lindley Street in Bridgeport, Connecticut, erupted into chaos. At the heart of the commotion stood a small bungalow at 966 Lindley Street, home to Gerard and Laura Gooden and their adopted daughter, Marcia. What began as odd household disturbances escalated into one of the most heavily documented and publicized poltergeist cases in American history. Unlike other hauntings whispered through folklore, this one was witnessed by over 70 individuals, police officers, firefighters, priests, and reporters, all of whom saw the impossible. What happened in that house was not an illusion. It was official. The activity started with knocks, scratching sounds inside the walls, and the family's cat, named Sam, reportedly speaking in human voices, cursing at the family in a raspy tone. Electrical appliances would turn on and off without warning. The refrigerator slid across the floor. A heavy television set tipped over. A crucifix flew from the wall and embedded itself into drywall. The family, Catholic and not prone to superstition, contacted the local priest. But after a visit proved inconclusive, they turned to the police. Bridgeport officers responded multiple times. On each occasion, they witnessed objects moving unaided, lamps toppling, doors slamming, chairs sliding across the floor. Officer Joseph Treffs documented a report that included seeing the living room recliner flip over while no one was near it. More than a dozen law enforcement personnel signed statements verifying what they saw. Yet nothing could be explained by natural causes. There were no earthquakes, no electrical faults, no footprints, no suspects. News of the disturbances reached local reporters, who were invited into the house. Soon, television crews and journalists arrived. One reporter from the Bridgeport Post captured a photograph of a small end table floating in midair. Firefighters attempting to stabilize the structure reported tools vanishing from their kits and reappearing elsewhere in the house. Police cordoned off the block due to the crowd size. At one point, more than 2,000 people gathered outside, hoping to glimpse the house that fought back. The Warrens, Ed and Lorraine, were called to investigate. Lorraine claimed the entity was not a ghost, but a demonic force attempting to mimic poltergeist behavior. Her analysis matched what others had reported. The activity was too calculated, too targeted. It wasn't chaotic. It had a rhythm. But then the case took a sharp turn. Under pressure from city officials and amid growing media scrutiny, the police declared that young Marcia had faked the entire event. She was briefly taken into custody, and the investigation was closed. Skeptics seized on the reversal as proof that it had all been a hoax, But those who had witnessed the early phenomena refused to recant. Officer Treffs later stated, "What I saw could not have been done by a little girl. I know what I saw." Firefighters interviewed years later also confirmed that many of the incidents occurred when Marcia was not in the room. Investigative author William J. Hall later obtained dozens of original police reports and cross-referenced the witness statements. The timelines didn't align with the hoax narrative. Some of the most dramatic incidents happened when Marcia was either outside or in full view of the officers. Despite this, the case was effectively buried. Media interest evaporated. The family refused further interviews. The house was sold quietly, and the new owners never spoke publicly. But the damage remained, not just to the Goodens, but to the credibility of the 70-plus professionals who dared to say they saw the unexplainable. When an entire block of government workers, first responders, and reporters document a haunting in real time, only to have the case abruptly shut down and dismissed, one must ask, was the threat truly a hoax, or was it the consequences of belief that frightened the system into silence? The Rosenheim Poltergeist. In late 1967, the tranquil German town of Rosenheim, Bavaria, became the stage for one of the most scientifically analyzed hauntings in modern European history. The epicenter, a modest law office on Königstrasse, where phones rang with no one on the line, fluorescent lights exploded spontaneously, and printers activated without input. What made this case extraordinary wasn't just the number of witnesses. It was the fact that the investigation was led not by ghost hunters, but by physicists, engineers, and police. When natural laws began to falter in a room built for legal logic, the line between science and superstition collapsed. The disturbances began subtly. Attorney Sigmund Adams' office staff complained that the phones were malfunctioning, ringing non-stop, making strange clicking sounds, and registering calls that no one had made. Over a single week, the phone system recorded over 600 phantom calls, some to random numbers, others to non-existent lines. Technicians from the local telephone company were dispatched. They replaced cables, switches, and circuits. The problem persisted. Then, the lights began flickering violently. Bulbs exploded in full view of staff. Fluorescent tubes twisted in their sockets. Electrical fuses blew out, one after another. By early November, typewriters began to jam without mechanical cause. Filing cabinet drawers flew open. Paintings rotated on the wall or fell without warning. Adam contacted local authorities, assuming foul play or vandalism. But forensic inspectors could find no tampering. That's when renowned parapsychologist Dr. Hans Bender of the University of Freiburg was brought in. Bender's team installed electromagnetic field detectors, voltage meters, oscilloscopes, and photographic equipment throughout the office. What they captured stunned even hardened skeptics. Electrical surges registered without identifiable sources. A fluorescent tube unscrewed itself while under direct surveillance. Phone lines emitted measurable pulses that had no electrical origin. Every physical parameter suggested interference, yet no device or human could be found to cause it. The investigation eventually focused on a single person, 19-year-old secretary, Anne-Marie Schneider. The phenomena consistently peaked when she was present, and subsided during her absence, but she was never seen directly touching or influencing any affected object. Psychological evaluations revealed high stress levels, but no pathology. Dr. Bender cautiously proposed that the disturbances might be the result of psychokinetic energy, an unconscious projection of internal tension manifesting in the physical world. He labeled the event Rosenheim Poltergeist, not as superstition, but as a testable, observable case of mind-matter interaction. Local police filed their own report, supporting the existence of unexplained disturbances. Insurance companies refused to cover damages, citing unclassifiable causes. The case was later published in scientific journals, making it the first poltergeist case to appear in mainstream academic literature with lab-grade data. Skeptics countered with accusations of fraud or group hysteria, but no evidence of staging was ever discovered. The sheer number of physical measurements made the case difficult to dismiss outright. Eventually, Schneider left her position, and the disturbances ceased. The law office remained operational, but took no further interviews. Dr. Bender maintained until his death that the Rosenheim case was the most scientifically valuable poltergeist phenomenon of the 20th century. His data remains archived in German universities and is still cited in studies of anomalous psychology and unexplained electrical phenomena. What sets the Rosenheim Poltergeist apart is not just the strangeness of the events, but the way they forced cold, empirical systems, courts, police, engineers, to confront an invisible force that obeyed none of their rules. If an ordinary office can become a node of impossible physics, triggered not by myth but by measurable interaction, then what unknown mechanisms lie dormant within the human mind, waiting to shatter the rules we think are permanent? The Southend police case. In the winter of 2006, in the coastal town of Southend-on-Sea, Essex, a seemingly routine emergency call led to an encounter that would rattle the nerves of two British police officers and challenge the boundaries of their training. A woman living in a small terraced home had phoned the police in distress, reporting that she was being tormented by a force she could neither see nor escape. What unfolded inside that house would be formally recorded in an official police report: a violent force, physical assault by an unseen entity, and an officer pushed across the room, without anyone standing near him. The Southend police case remains one of the only known instances in the United Kingdom where officers submitted sworn statements describing direct contact with what could only be called a paranormal assailant. The woman, who requested anonymity, had lived alone since her husband's passing and had no prior history of mental illness or criminal behavior. Over the course of several nights, she reported waking up with bruises, hearing aggressive knocking from inside the walls, and feeling intense cold spots that seemed to follow her from room to room. Lamps shattered without cause, doors slammed shut even when windows were closed. By the third incident, she was too frightened to sleep and called emergency services, fearing she was being attacked by an intruder, or something worse. 2 officers were dispatched to her residence. The initial walkthrough yielded nothing unusual. No signs of forced entry, no visible damage. But as they entered the living room, the temperature dropped sharply. One officer would later report a sudden pressure against his chest and shoulder. Moments later, as he approached a corner of the room, he was flung backward several feet, hitting the wall. His partner, standing a few feet behind him, witnessed the event with no explanation. There were no wires, no attackers, and no physical object in contact with the officer. Shaken but composed, the officers filed a report back at the station. The report specifically stated that the cause of the physical push was unknown and not attributable to any visible threat. The case was referred internally, but no further action was taken. When asked by local media about the report, which had leaked through unofficial channels, the police department gave a terse response. "We investigate all emergency calls seriously. No charges were filed, and no suspects were identified." Word spread quickly. Local newspapers dubbed it the Southend Poltergeist. Paranormal investigators arrived in the area, attempting to interview the woman and reconstruct the night's events. Most were turned away. The homeowner moved out within weeks, citing persistent fear and sleep deprivation. The house remained vacant for months before being quietly sold. Retired officer statements added weight to the event. One of the officers involved, speaking off the record years later, said, "I've faced armed suspects, domestic violence, riots. Nothing compares to walking into a silent room and feeling something you can't see shove you like it wants you gone." Skeptics argued that stress, poor lighting, or even vertigo might explain the event. But these theories collapsed under the report's description. The officer didn't fall or stumble. He was launched sideways, with force. His injuries, while minor, were consistent with sudden impact. There were no environmental triggers, and both officers were tested for drugs or medical anomalies. None were found. To this day, the Southend Police Department has never officially retracted the incident report. It remains in internal archives, a quiet anomaly in an otherwise orderly system of rational cause and effect. When the protectors of law and order encounter an enemy that can't be cuffed, charged, or explained, the question isn't whether a crime occurred, but whether something older than law decided to remind us it still exists. The Guyra Ghost. In April 1921, in the sleepy rural town of Guyra, New South Wales, Australia, a small weatherboard cottage became the scene of a mystery that would dominate headlines across the nation. The Bowen family, who lived there, claimed their home was under siege, not by criminals or animals, but by a force that could throw rocks, hammer on walls, and speak in whispers from behind closed doors. The story drew such intense public and official scrutiny that it eventually involved the local police, state investigators, and even members of parliament. It would become known as the Guyra Ghost, one of the earliest officially acknowledged poltergeist incidents in the Southern Hemisphere. It began one quiet night when large stones pelted the roof of the Bowen home with alarming force. The family rushed outside, but found no one. The following evening, the attacks resumed. This time, rocks crashed through windows and heavy thuds vibrated the walls. The family contacted local police, who arrived quickly and searched the property. No intruders were found, but when the officers remained on site the next night, the rocks fell again, this time within inches of them. They searched the surrounding land with lanterns, posted guards, and even called in reinforcements. Still, the phenomena continued. Inspector Gilroy from the New South Wales Police Force was dispatched to oversee the growing situation. He brought additional officers and monitored the property for over a week. According to his written reports, his men witnessed no visible attackers, but heard deliberate pounding and saw stones fall in unnatural arcs, as if lobbed from nowhere. Every possible angle of approach was surveyed. No footprints were found. Traps set in nearby foliage remained undisturbed. Journalists from the Sydney Morning Herald arrived and spent nights in the home with the family and the police. They, too, documented the stone throwing and wrote articles describing the violent yet invisible assault on the Bowen home. As public fascination surged, dozens of townspeople began camping nearby, hoping to witness the spectacle. Authorities eventually had to rope off the area to prevent interference. Attention soon turned to 12-year-old Minnie Bowen, the youngest daughter. Investigators noticed that the phenomena often intensified when she was present. Accusations of trickery emerged, though no one could explain how a child under constant watch could cause such events. Paranormal theorists of the era speculated about unconscious telekinetic projection, a concept just beginning to enter public discourse. Minnie was temporarily relocated to a nearby town. For 2 nights, the house fell silent. But on the 3rd night, the banging returned, this time louder, more chaotic. When questioned by authorities, Minnie tearfully denied any deception. Her parents, deeply religious, forbade her from engaging in any mischief, and no evidence ever surfaced to prove a hoax. In a rare and controversial move, the police issued a statement saying that while they could not prove supernatural involvement, the phenomena were physically real and unaccounted for by known means. Eventually, the activity tapered off. The Bowen family remained in the house, though they refused further interviews. The police never reopened the investigation, citing a lack of criminal elements, but the case continued to be referenced in parliamentary debates as an example of official resources being directed to a matter of inexplicable origin. Unlike many hauntings relegated to urban legend, the Guyra Ghost left behind a paper trail. Police reports, government memos, journalist eyewitness accounts, and state-sanctioned investigation notes, all describing something no court could prosecute. If a town's law enforcement, reporters, and government officials all converge on a house to witness rocks falling from the sky with no hands to throw them, what exactly was being besieged, the house or our understanding of what a home can contain? The Hinsdale House? In the early 1970s, nestled among the rolling hills of Hinsdale, New York, stood a remote farmhouse on McMahon Road, a 2-story wooden structure surrounded by thick forest and near-total silence. What happened inside that house would go on to inspire dozens of paranormal investigations, official priestly interventions, and police responses to inexplicable activity. Known today as the Hinsdale House, it remains one of the few haunted locations in the United States where a formal Catholic exorcism was performed on the building itself, not the people inside. The haunting began in 1973 when the Dandy family, Clara, Phil, and their children, moved into the property seeking peace and a new start. But almost immediately they noticed something was off. Doors opened and shut on their own. Footsteps echoed from upstairs bedrooms when no one was there. Phone lines went dead for hours without technical explanation. But what started as typical haunting phenomena soon escalated into something far more threatening. One night, the family reported seeing a full-body apparition of a man in old-fashioned clothing standing silently in the hallway, only to vanish when approached. The children described faceless figures hovering at the edges of their beds. Lights flickered in sequence, responding almost like Morse code. On several occasions, members of the family felt invisible hands gripping their arms and necks. One daughter had a seizure after claiming something had entered her room and whispered in her ear, As the disturbances grew violent, the family contacted local law enforcement. Officers were dispatched multiple times to respond to what they believed were prowler calls or intrusions. Each time, they found no evidence of forced entry, but several officers described experiencing nausea, dizziness, and a feeling of being watched while inside the house. Their reports documented no criminal activity, but acknowledged the strange, repeated disturbances. Desperate for help, the dandies contacted Father Alphonsus Trabold, a Catholic priest from nearby St. Bonaventure University, with experience in exorcisms and spiritual investigations. Father Trabold visited the house multiple times and performed a full exorcism on the property, an uncommon and serious rite that typically requires Vatican-level approval. According to his written notes, objects levitated, unexplainable shadows moved along the walls, and at one point, a cross fixed to the wall spun upside down as he was reciting prayers. Despite the exorcism, the activity persisted. Father Trabold eventually advised the family to move out permanently. The dandies, exhausted and financially drained, complied. The house stood empty for years, but locals continued to report hearing chanting from the woods, seeing flickering lights in the windows, and shadowy figures pacing across the second-floor hallway. Later investigations by multiple paranormal teams, including television crews, yielded strange EMF readings, unrecordable voice phenomena, and video malfunctions at the moment of heightened activity. Several researchers abandoned their work midway, citing hostile conditions inside the house. Some claimed they were followed home by the entity, experiencing activity in their own homes days after leaving. Unlike many haunting stories, the Hinsdale case is supported by a paper trail of police reports, priestly documentation, and consistent testimonies from unrelated witnesses. The events are not isolated incidents, but a continuous, decades-long phenomenon that continues to affect anyone who enters the property. Today, the house is privately owned and maintained as a paranormal research site. Visitors must sign waivers acknowledging the history of violent hauntings and are prohibited from sleeping overnight without approval. Despite multiple cleansing rituals, the atmosphere inside remains oppressive. Footsteps still echo when the rooms are empty. Lights flicker in patterns, and the woods, silent during the day, come alive at night with whispers in languages no one can place. When even a priest declares a house too dangerous for humans, and police reports quietly acknowledge events they cannot explain, the haunting no longer belongs to superstition. It becomes an architectural fact. Conclusion: these 10 hauntings are not stitched together from urban legends or passed down ghost stories. They are threaded through police reports, government files, psychological evaluations, forensic documentation, and sworn testimonies. They bear the cold imprint of law enforcement stamps and medical forms, not the exaggerations of myth. Taken separately, each case might be seen as a bizarre anomaly. But together, they expose a disturbing pattern, a model of encounters so consistent, so thoroughly documented, that their implications demand more than disbelief. These are not simply stories of frightened families or creaking homes. They are incidents that compelled the intervention of entire systems. Police departments, state agencies, hospitals, churches. These systems were built to categorize, control, and resolve human crisis. And yet, in every case, they stepped back. The hauntings outpaced their protocols, resisted categorization, and remained active even under scientific or religious scrutiny. What's more chilling is the way these phenomena were ultimately handled, not solved, but contained, silenced, or ignored. Witnesses were reassigned, files were closed, reports were archived without follow-up. In several cases, the structures were demolished, not because the haunting was disproven, but because no one could explain it, and no system wanted to admit it couldn't. These hauntings didn't just defy understanding, they exposed the fragility of the structures we rely on to tell us what is real. And in the absence of resolution, we are left with unanswered questions. What are these forces? Why do they seem aware? Why do they escalate only when attention is paid? And perhaps most frightening of all, why do they stop only when we leave? Because maybe these aren't just remnants of trauma or imagination. Maybe they're reminders. That reality is not as solid as we think. That belief is not required for something to exist. That the unknown doesn't ask for permission to enter our homes. It simply waits until someone calls for help, and no one can help. The tragedy isn't that we don't understand these events. It's that those who do stop talking.